Everyone in that courtroom thought I had lost my mind. My mother-in-law smirked. His mistress rolled her eyes, and Julian looked at me with pity as I signed away everything. But when Julian placed his signature next to mine, he did not just win a fortune. He voluntarily walked into a financial grave worth $25 million that I had spent 5 years digging just for him. My name is Cora Ellington, and as I sat in the hard wooden chair of courtroom 304, I could feel the cold dampness of the Cook County family court seeping through the thin fabric of my blouse. The room was designed to be sterile, a place where emotions were stripped away by the harsh fluorescent lights and the scent of floor wax. But today, the atmosphere was thick with something else entirely. It was suffocating. The air did not smell of justice or the stale coffee of overworked clerks. Instead, the entire space had been colonized by the cloying, aggressive scent of tuberose and vanilla. It was a perfume that cost $300 an ounce, worn by a woman who had never earned a dime in her life. Sienna sat 2 rows behind the defendant's table, leaning forward just enough to be seen but not enough to be reprimanded by the bailiff. Every time I inhaled, I tasted her presence. It was the scent of my replacement. She was practically vibrating with victory, her manicured fingers drumming silently on the back of the bench, but she was merely a spectator to the real executioner. Julian Thorne sat across from me, my husband, the man I had shared a bed with for a decade. He was wearing his navy bespoke Armani suit, the one I had picked out for him in Milan 3 years ago. It fit him perfectly, hugging his shoulders in a way that projected power and competence, disguising the rot that lay beneath. He looked immaculate. His hair was gelled back with precision, his jawline set in that familiar expression of arrogant determination. It was the look he wore when he was closing a deal. The look that said he was the smartest person in the room, and everyone else was merely a resource to be exploited. He did not look like a man whose marriage was dissolving. He looked like a man who was about to acquire a distressed asset for pennies on the dollar. To his right sat the peanut gallery from hell. Beatrice Thorne, my mother-in-law, sat with her back ramrod straight, clutching her pearl necklace as if my mere presence might tarnish the silver clasp from across the room. She had never liked me. To Beatrice, I was the daughter of a public school teacher who had somehow tricked her golden boy into marriage. She called it marrying up. I called it a mistake. Today, she was whispering to Sienna, her lips moving in rapid, venomous bursts. I did not need to hear the words to know what they were saying. They were gloating. They were celebrating the exorcism of the parasite. Beatrice's eyes darted toward me, cold and hard as flint, before she turned back to Sienna and shared a conspiratorial giggle that echoed softly in the quiet room. "Mrs. Thorne?" A voice cut through the thick tension. It was Marcus Vance, Julian's lawyer. He corrected himself with a sneer that was barely concealed behind professional courtesy. "Ms. Ellington, Marcus slid a heavy binder across the polished mahogany table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. He was a shark in a $2,000 suit, a man who charged $600 an hour to destroy lives, and he looked at me with the weary condescension of a teacher scolding a slow student. "This is the final draft, Cora," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a smooth, coercive baritone. "Julian is being generous, considering the circumstances. This is your last chance to walk away with a little bit of dignity intact. Do not drag this out, for everyone's sake." I looked down at the document. It was thick, dense with legal jargon, but I knew exactly what it said. I knew every clause, every addendum, and every footnote because I had spent sleepless nights memorizing the structure of Julian's greed. The terms were brutal. They were designed to strip me bare. Julian would retain sole ownership of the Oakhaven estate, the sprawling mansion that I had decorated, managed, and turned into a home while he was out networking until 3 a.m. He would keep the collection of vintage sports cars. He would keep the portfolio of stocks. And most importantly, he would keep 100% of Thorne Capital, the investment firm that he considered his legacy. his lifeblood, the proof of his genius. And me, I was granted full physical custody of our daughter. Mia. That was the only thing I had truly fought for, and the only thing Julian had given up without a fight. To him, a 6-year-old girl was not an asset. She was a liability, an expense, an anchor that would slow down his jet-setting lifestyle with Sienna. Along with Mia, I would receive a lump sum of $50,000, a pittance compared to our net worth, and the title to the 5-year-old SUV I drove. Take the car and the kid, his eyes seemed to say. Leave the money to the men. I let my gaze drift from the paper up to Julian. He was watching me closely, searching for cracks. He wanted to see me break. He wanted tears. He wanted me to beg him for the beach house or a higher alimony payment so he could lean back, laugh, and say no. He thrived on the power dynamic of being the benevolent dictator denying a peasant's request. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I reached for the silver pen lying on the table. My hand trembled. It was a slight movement, a subtle vibration of my fingers, but I saw Julian's eyes lock onto it immediately. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He thought I was terrified. He thought the weight of poverty was crushing me. He thought I was afraid of the future, of a life without his credit cards and his country club memberships. I hesitated. I let the pen hover over the signature line on the last page. I bit my lip, forcing my eyes to widen slightly, feigning the look of a trapped animal. "Julian," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "is there really no other way?" "The house Mia grew up there." Julian sighed, a theatrical exhale of exaggerated patience. "Cora, please, don't make a scene. You are not equipped to manage an estate like Oakhaven. It requires capital. It requires vision. You have always been happier with less. I am doing you a favor. I am unburdening you." "And the company?" I asked, looking down at the bold letters of Thorn Capital on page 4. "The company is complex financial machinery. Cora," he said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, "it is volatile. You wouldn't understand the current market exposure. Just sign the papers. Take the SUV. Go pick up Mia from school. Start your new life." Beatrice let out a loud huff from the back. Checking her diamond-encrusted watch, the pressure in the room ratcheted up. Marcus tapped his finger on the table next to the signature line. A rhythmic, impatient sound. "Sign it, Cora," Marcus urged, "before he changes his mind about the 50,000. I looked at the paper again. This was the moment, the culmination of 5 years of silence, 5 years of biting my tongue when he belittled me in front of his friends, 5 years of finding lipstick stains on his collars and pretending they were wine, 5 years of playing the role of the dim-witted trophy wife who thought ROI was a brand of expensive handbag. I gripped the pen tighter. The trembling in my hand stopped instantly. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the silence of the courtroom. Cora Ellington. I signed my name with a flourish, a loops and curves strong and defined. It was not the signature of a defeated woman. It was a declaration of war. I put the cap back on the pen with a sharp click. Then, I raised my head. I looked straight at Julian. I did not blink. I did not tear up. The mask of the scared housewife evaporated, revealing the face of the risk analyst I used to be before he convinced me to dim my light. I looked into his eyes, those arrogant, shallow eyes, and I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a smile of relief. It was a small ghost of a smile, cold and sharp as a scalpel. It was the kind of smile a bomb disposal expert might have right after cutting the red wire. Knowing the timer had stopped with 1 second to go, for a brief second, Julian faltered. His smirk wavered. He saw something in my expression that he hadn't seen in a decade. Intelligence, calculation, danger. A flicker of unease passed through his eyes. He shifted in his seat, his confidence momentarily punctured by that inexplicable smile. But then, his greed took over. The allure of total victory was too strong. He practically snatched the document from under my hand. He didn't even look at me anymore. He was looking at the prize. He uncapped his gold fountain pen, a gift from me for our 5th anniversary, and bent over the table. Marcus Vance, the shark, seemed to sense the shift in the water. He frowned, his eyes darting between my calm face and Julian's eager hand. "Julian, wait," Marcus murmured, reaching out a hand as if to pause him. "Let me just review the addendum on page 65 one more time regarding the asset consolidation clause." "We went over this, Marcus," Julian snapped, his voice loud and impatient. "She signed. It's done. I'm not wasting another hour here billing your time while you read boilerplate text. I have a dinner reservation at Le Monde." Julian ignored his lawyer. He ignored the sudden chill that had seemingly dropped the room's temperature by 10 degrees. He ignored the intuition that should have screamed at him that his wife, the woman he called simple, was looking at him like a spider watching a fly struggle in silk. He signed, "Julian Thorne." He scribbled his name with aggressive strokes. Pressing so hard the nib almost tore the paper, he signed away his life. Thinking he was claiming his kingdom, the scratching stopped. He sat back, chest heaving slightly with the thrill of the win. He looked at me, his arrogance returning in a tidal wave. "There," he said, buttoning his jacket. "It is finished." I leaned back in my chair, the tension leaving my shoulders. "Yes," I said softly, my voice steady and clear. "It is finished." Julian handed the papers to the court clerk with a flourish. He stood up, turning to wink at Sienna, who blew him a kiss. Beatrice was already gathering her purse, looking eager to leave the proximity of my failure. But they didn't know. None of them knew. They saw a woman who had lost her home, her husband, and her fortune. They saw a victim. I looked at Julian's back as he began to celebrate with his mistress. I thought about the ink drying on that page. I thought about the hidden mechanisms within those legal clauses that were now grinding into motion. Invisible gears turning to crush him. To understand why that small, cold smile I gave him was worth $25 million, and why Julian Thorne was actually the poorest man in Chicago the moment he put that pen down. You have to understand the history. You have to understand that before I was Mrs. Thorne, the socialite hostess, I was Cora Ellington, the best forensic accountant and risk analyst Stratton Dynamics had ever hired. You have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back 10 years, to the day I met him, back when I was still a girl who believed in fairy tales, before I learned that sometimes. The prince is actually the dragon, and the only knight coming to save you is yourself. 10 years ago, I was not a woman who could be silenced with a diamond necklace or a week in the Hamptons. I was a weapon in a tailored skirt suit. At 26, I was a senior risk analyst at Stratton Dynamics, one of the most aggressive hedge funds in Chicago. My life was defined by algorithms, probability matrices, and the absolute, unyielding truth of numbers. I loved the job. I loved the way a spreadsheet could tell a story more honest than any biography. I had a reputation for smelling smoke before anyone else even saw a spark. I could look at a company's quarterly report and tell you within 10 minutes if they were inflating their assets or bleeding cash in offshore accounts. I was sharp. I was ambitious. I was free. Then came Julian. He did not walk into my life. He staged a hostile takeover of it. We met at a fintech conference in New York. I was presenting a paper on market volatility. He was the keynote speaker. Julian Thorne was the prince of venture capital, the man who supposedly had the Midas touch. When he looked at me across that crowded banquet hall, I felt like a target acquired by a precision missile. He was charming. Of course, men like Julian are bred to be charming. He possessed a gravitational pull that bent the room around him. He pursued me with the same relentless intensity he used to acquire struggling startups. It was a whirlwind of private jets, midnight dinners in Paris, and bouquets of white roses that arrived at my office every single morning for 3 months. I was flattered. I was overwhelmed. I was young enough to mistake possession for passion. He told me he wanted to build a world for us. He told me that I had been fighting the world alone for too long and that it was time for me to rest. "Just let me take care of everything," he would whisper into my ear. his voice low and hypnotic. "You have worked hard enough, Cora. Let me be your shield." I believed him. That was my first mistake. I mistook a cage for a castle because the bars were made of gold. The wedding was the social event of the season. It cost $600,000, a sum that made my pragmatic father choke on his champagne. I walked down the aisle in a Vera Wang gown that cost more than my first car. Blinded by the flashbulbs of society photographers, I thought I was walking toward my happily ever after. In reality, I was walking into early retirement. The request came 2 weeks after the honeymoon. We were sitting on the terrace of our new estate, Oakhaven, overlooking the manicured lawns that stretched for acres. Julian poured me a glass of vintage Chardonnay and took my hand. "I need you here, Cora," he said, his eyes pleading. "My business is expanding, the networking, the dinners. The image I cannot do it without a solid rear guard. I need someone I trust to manage our life so I can go out and conquer the world for us. Stratton Dynamics is beneath you. Being Mrs. Thorne is a full-time job." It sounded logical at the time. It sounded like a partnership. So, I resigned. I packed up my desk, said goodbye to my colleagues, who looked at me with a mixture of envy and confusion, and went home to Oakhaven. I traded my Bloomberg terminal for a seating chart. I traded my financial independence for a role as the perfect hostess. The control did not happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping frost. It started with the finances. Julian insisted that we merge everything, but in practice, that meant he controlled everything. He gave me a supplementary credit card, a sleek black piece of plastic linked to his main account. "Buy whatever you want," he said generously. "I never want you to worry about a price tag again." But the first time I used it to buy a vintage first edition book for $400. My phone buzzed within 30 seconds. It was a text from Julian. "Books, I thought you were going shopping for the gala dress." It was a joke. He claimed later, just teasing, but it happened again, and again. Every swipe of the card was a signal sent to his phone. If I bought groceries at Whole Foods, he knew. If I had lunch with an old friend, he knew. I began to feel a phantom weight on my wrist every time I reached for my wallet. Meanwhile, Julian's spending was a black box. He spoke of investments and capital calls that required transfers of $50,000 or $100,000 at a time. When I asked about them, he would smile that dazzling, dismissive smile. "High risk, high reward. Darling, don't bore yourself with the gritty details. Look at the new Audi in the driveway. That is the reward." Then came Mia. I thought a child would bridge the growing distance between us. When I found out I was pregnant, I wept with joy. Julian popped a bottle of Dom Perignon and toasted to his heir. But when Mia was born, the reality shattered my heart. Julian did not want a daughter. He wanted a prop. He was never there for the 2 o'clock feedings. He was never there for the fevers or the first steps. But when Forbes magazine wanted to do a feature on the family man behind the billions, Julian was suddenly Father of the Year. He posed in the garden, holding Mia in his arms, smiling that perfect, white-toothed smile, while a team of stylists adjusted the lighting. As soon as the photographer said cut, he handed Mia back to the nanny like she was a piece of rented equipment. "She spit up on my lapel," he complained, wiping his suit with a look of mild disgust. "Get this cleaned before the dinner tonight." I stood there, holding my crying daughter, and felt the first true crack in the foundation of my adoration. I realized I was not his partner. I was the curator of his image. Mia and I were just beautiful objects he kept on a shelf to prove to the world that he was a normal, functioning human being. The isolation at Oakhaven became absolute. My old friends from the finance world stopped calling. We had nothing in common anymore. They were talking about market trends and promotion tracks. I was talking about the best caterer for a charity silent auction. Julian discouraged me from seeing them anyway. "They are jealous of you, Cora," he would say. "They are working 9-to-5 jobs while you live in a palace. It just makes them bitter. Stick to the neighborhood." So I tried. I tried to befriend the women of Oakhaven, But these were women who had been in the cage so long they had forgotten how to fly. Our conversations were vapid loops of nothingness. We talked about the waiting list for the private preschool. We talked about the authenticity of handbags. We talked about which plastic surgeon did the best eyelid lifts. No one talked about ideas. No one talked about the news. Unless it affected their husband's tax bracket. I was lonely in a house of 20 rooms. The silence of Oakhaven was heavy. It pressed against my eardrums. I would walk through the hallways, touching the silk wallpapers and the marble busts, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. The signs of Julian's betrayal were there, scattered like breadcrumbs, but for a long time, I refused to look at them. I was in denial. I did not want to admit that the risk analyst had made the biggest bad investment of her life. Julian began to vanish. It started with late meetings that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Then it was business trips to Miami or Las Vegas that lasted a week. When he came home, he smelled different. It was not just the stale air of a plane cabin. He smelled of expensive scotch, a brand he didn't keep at home, and a perfume that was sweeter, muskier than anything I wore. One night, he came home at 3 a.m. I was awake, sitting in the living room with a book I wasn't reading. He stumbled in, his tie loose, his eyes glassy. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice thick with irritation rather than concern. "I was worried," I said. "You didn't answer my texts." "I was closing a deal." "Cora," he snapped, throwing his keys onto the console table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet foyer. "God, you are suffocating. Do you have any idea the pressure I am under? I am out there making millions to keep you in this lifestyle, and all you do is sit here and nag me about text messages." "I just wanted to know if you were safe," I said quietly. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "I am fine. Go to bed, and stop looking at me like that. You look old when you worry." He brushed past me, and the scent of that other perfume hit me again. It was undeniable, but worse than the infidelity was the intellectual disrespect. A week later, I tried to ask him about the household budget. The expenses for Oakhaven were astronomical. Landscaping alone was $5,000 a month, and I noticed that the balance in the joint account was fluctuating wildly. "Julian," I asked over breakfast, "I noticed a withdrawal of $75,000 last Tuesday. What was that for? I don't see an invoice." He lowered his newspaper and looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup. His expression was one of bored tolerance, as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler. "It is a bridge loan for a portfolio company. Cora, it is complicated structure. You wouldn't understand the mechanics of it. I used to build risk models for multinational corporations." "Julian," I reminded him, my voice tightening, "I think I can understand a bridge loan." "That was 10 years ago," he sneered. "The market has changed. You have been out of the game too long. You are a mother now. You are good at hosting parties. You are good at looking beautiful on my arm. Let's stick to your strengths. Shall we leave the money to the men who actually earn it?" He stood up, kissed me on the forehead, a kiss that felt like a brand of ownership, and left. I sat there at the long dining table, staring at his empty chair. The anger that flared in my chest was not the hot, tearful anger of a scorned wife. It was something colder. It was the icy, clinical detachment of my former self waking up from a long coma. "You wouldn't understand," he had said, but my brain, dormant for so long, began to whir. The patterns were wrong. A bridge loan from a personal joint account. That was sloppy. That was amateur. Julian Thorne was many things, but he was not an amateur. Why would a man who ran a billion-dollar hedge fund need to raid his domestic account for $75,000? I looked around the room. The crystal chandelier, the velvet drapes, the meticulously arranged fresh flowers. It all looked perfect, but I knew, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that I was looking at a stage set. The air in the house felt thin. My instinct, that old sharp internal alarm that had saved Stratton Dynamics millions of dollars in the past, began to scream. Something was wrong, not just with our marriage, but with the foundation of the world Julian had built. The numbers he threw around, the lavish spending, the constant need for cash, the secrecy. It didn't smell like success. It smelled like desperation. I stood up. I walked to the window and looked out at the golden cage of Oakhaven. The tears I had been holding back evaporated. I didn't need to cry. I needed to calculate. If my husband thought I was too stupid to understand his business, then perhaps it was time I took a look at the books myself. He had forgotten who I was. He thought he had married a trophy. He forgot that before I was a decoration, I was an auditor, and I was about to audit his entire life. Fate, it turns out, has a twisted sense of humor. It did not arrive in the form of an FBI raid or a whistleblower's email. It arrived in the form of a patch of ice on a Black Diamond ski run in Aspen. Julian had gone on a networking retreat with potential investors. In reality, it was an excuse to drink scotch at 8,000 feet and flirt with women half his age. On the third day, I received a call. Julian had taken a turn too fast, lost control, and fractured his tibia. He was sedated in a private hospital in Colorado, groggy and irritable, demanding that I handle the administrative mess he had left behind. The insurance papers, he slurred over the phone, his voice thick with painkillers. They need the policy number for the medevac flight. It is in my desk, top drawer. The code is 4821. He hung up before I could ask how he was feeling. I drove into the city, the skyline of Chicago looming gray and sharp against the winter sky. Thorne Capital occupied the 45th floor of a glass monolith on Wacker Drive. It was a Saturday, and the building was mostly empty. The silence in the lobby felt heavy, amplified by the click-clack of my boots on the polished marble. When the elevator doors slid open, I expected an empty office. Instead, I found a barrier, sitting at the reception desk, looking bored and scrolling through her phone. Was a young woman I had never met. She looked up as I stepped off the elevator, her eyes narrowing instantly. She was stunning in a way that felt aggressive, sharp features, sleek dark hair, and a blouse that was unbuttoned one notch too low for a professional setting. "Can I help you?" she asked. She did not stand up. Her tone suggested I was a solicitor trying to sell her encyclopedias. "I am Cora Thorne," I said, keeping my voice level. "I need to get something from my husband's office." The recognition in her eyes was instant, followed immediately by a flash of hostility that took me by surprise. She did not look apologetic or welcoming. She looked like a guard dog whose territory had been breached. "Mr. Thorne did not authorize any visitors," she said, crossing her arms. "I am Sienna, his executive assistant, and unless I get a call from him directly, nobody goes back there. Company policy." I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the Cartier bracelet on her wrist, a piece that cost $6,000. I saw the way she looked at me with a mixture of disdain and pity. And I realized, with a jolt of intuition, that she was not just an assistant. She was the reason Julian had been working late for the past 6 months. I did not get angry. I did not shout. I channeled the version of myself that used to stare down CEOs during audit meetings. "Sienna," I said, stepping closer until I was looming over her desk. "My husband is currently lying in a hospital bed in Aspen with a broken leg. He gave me the security code. He sent me here. Now, you have 2 choices. You can continue to play gatekeeper and explain to Julian why his medical transport was denied because his assistant refused to let his wife get the insurance policy, or you can sit there, be quiet, and let me do what I came here to do." I held her gaze. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to fight, but the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her. She was young, and she was terrified of Julian's temper. "Fine," she spat out, swiveling her chair away. "Make it quick." I walked past her, feeling her glare on my back like a physical weight. Julian's office was a shrine to his own ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the lake. The furniture was Italian leather. The walls were lined with awards and framed magazine covers. It looked like the office of a titan. I went to the desk. I punched in the code, 4821. The lock clicked open. The insurance folder was right where he said it would be. I pulled it out, took a picture of the policy number, and sent it to the hospital. Mission accomplished. I should have left. I should have walked out, gone home, and continued living in my ignorance, but the drawer was stuck. When I tried to slide it back in, it jammed. I jiggled it, pulled it out further, and knelt down to see what was blocking the track. Wedged deep in the back, taped to the underside of the mahogany surface with black electrical tape, was a small, ruggedized hard drive. It had a piece of masking tape on it with 2 words scrawled in Julian's handwriting, Project Phoenix. My heart skipped a beat. In the world of finance, you do not tape hard drives to the bottom of drawers unless you are hiding something that cannot exist on the company server. I peeled the tape back. The drive felt cold and heavy in my hand. I looked out at the reception area. Sienna was on the phone, laughing loudly, her back to me. I slipped the drive into my purse. The drive home was a blur. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I got to Oakhaven, I went straight to the guest bedroom that I used as a storage space. I dug out my old laptop, a battered machine that I hadn't turned on in 4 years. It was air-gapped, disconnected from the cloud, and safe. I plugged in the drive. It was encrypted. Of course, a standard AES 256-bit encryption. Julian was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. However, he was also a creature of habit. I tried his birthday, failed. I tried Mia's birthday, failed. I tried our anniversary, failed. Then I thought about his ego. I thought about the name of the drive, Phoenix, the bird that rises from the ashes. It was his favorite metaphor for his career. I typed in, rise from the ashes. Access denied. I closed my eyes. I thought about the man I knew. He was obsessed with winning. He was obsessed with the year he made his first million. I typed in, first million, 1999. The screen flashed green. The folders appeared. I spent the next 6 hours sitting on the floor, surrounded by digital carnage. As I opened file after file, the blood drained from my face until I felt lightheaded. Thorn Capital was a lie. It was not just struggling, it was a corpse that Julian had been dressing up in expensive suits. The investment returns he reported to his clients steady. Consistent gains of 12% year over year were mathematically impossible in the current market. I opened the transaction logs. The pattern was unmistakable. It was a classic, textbook Ponzi scheme. He was bringing in money from new investors' doctors, retirees, friends from the country club, and using that cash to pay dividends to the older investors to keep them happy. There was no actual trading. There were no assets. The proprietary algorithm he bragged about was just a spreadsheet where he moved numbers from column A to column B. But that was not the worst of it. I found a folder named Liquidity Collateral. Inside were PDF scans of loan agreements, dozens of them. I opened the first one. It was a mortgage on the Oakhaven estate. I frowned. We had paid off the house 3 years ago, or so he had told me. I looked at the signature line, Julian Thorne and Cora Ellington Thorne. My signature was there. It was a perfect replica of my handwriting. The loops, the slant, the pressure, it was flawless. But I knew I had never signed this document. The date was June 12th, 2 years ago. I checked my digital calendar on my phone. On June 12th, I was in Wisconsin visiting my sick mother. I scrolled down. There was a loan against the cars, a loan against my personal savings account, a loan against Mia's college fund. Then I saw the lenders. These were not banks. They were LLCs with names like Obsidian Holdings and Vanguard Shadow Corp. I knew these names. In my old life as a risk analyst, we called them predatory lenders. They were the kind of people who did not sue you when you defaulted. They sent men to break your knees. I pulled up a summary spreadsheet titled Global Exposure. The total debt was not a few $100,000. It was $28 million. $400,000. I stared at the number. The digits seemed to swim before my eyes. 28 million. I scrolled to the expenditures tab to see where the money had gone. It hadn't gone into the business. Rent, penthouse apartment 4B, $12,000 per month. Sienna's apartment, Cartier, $6,000. The bracelet I saw today, Private jet charter. Las Vegas, $40,000. Cash withdrawal. Casino, $100,000. He was burning the money. He was living a life of debauchery on borrowed time and stolen money. And he had forged my signature on every single document to do it. I opened a document titled Joint Liability Agreement. It was a terrifying legal instrument. It stated that because the loans were family associated, both spouses were 100% liable for the full amount. I sat back, the laptop burning my legs. I was not just the wife of a fraudster, I was his accomplice on paper. If the SEC found out, I would go to prison. If the lenders came calling, they would take everything I owned, down to the clothes on my back, if Julian defaulted and looking at the burn rate. He was about 3 months away from total collapse. We would be destitute. The room felt like it was spinning. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea rolled over me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fly to Aspen and strangle him in his hospital bed. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to grab Mia and run. Panic is the enemy of profit. The voice in my head was my old mentor, Elias. It was the first rule of risk management. When the market crashes, the amateurs panic and sell. The professionals stop, breathe, and look for the exit strategy. I forced myself to inhale. 1, 2, 3. I looked at the screen again. The evidence was damning, but it was also power. Julian did not know I had this. He thought I was the clueless housewife who couldn't balance a checkbook. He thought he was safe. If I confronted him now, he would destroy me. He would hide the assets he had left. He would blame me. He would use his high-priced lawyers to paint me as the mastermind. He would claim I signed those documents willingly. It would be his word against mine. And he was the charming prince of Chicago. I needed a plan. I closed the laptop. I pulled out the hard drive and hid it inside the lining of my winter coat hanging in the back of the closet. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror. "Stop it," I whispered to my reflection. "You are not a victim. You are an analyst. This is just a problem set. Solve for X." I realized then that I couldn't leave him, not yet, if I divorced him now. The debt would follow me. The joint liability clause was a trap. I had to find a way to sever myself from that debt before the ship sank. I had to make him take it, all of it. I walked out of the bathroom. I went downstairs to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. My hands were steady now. The fear had crystallized into something sharp and cold. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Julian. "Got the policy number. Hope you are feeling better. Darling, I love you." I hit send. The war had begun, and the first shot was silence. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was a shedding of skin, a slow, deliberate hardening of my resolve. When Julian returned from Aspen, hobbling on crutches and high on painkillers, he did not come home to the wife who had discovered his financial infidelity. He came home to the greatest performance of my life. I became the caricature of the woman he thought I was. I became poor, sweet Cora. I fluffed his pillows. I brought him his espresso on a silver tray. When he ranted about the incompetence of his staff or the volatility of the market, I widened my eyes and nodded with vacuous adoration. "It sounds so stressful, darling," I would coo, smoothing the blanket over his cast. "I don't know how you keep all those big numbers in your head. I get a headache just trying to calculate the tip for the delivery boy." Julian ate it up. His ego was bruised from the accident, and he needed the constant reinforcement of my inferiority to feel powerful again. He would pat my hand, offering a benevolent, condescending smile. "That is why I handle the heavy lifting. Cora, you just worry about keeping the house beautiful." "You are so strong," I whispered, while mentally calculating the exact prison sentence for wire fraud. While Julian slept, sedated by his medication, I went to work. My first move was to find an ally. I could not use the family lawyers. They were on Julian's payroll. I needed someone who knew where the bodies were buried but had no interest in digging them up for profit. I reached out to Elias Thorne. Despite the shared surname, he was no relation to Julian. Elias was a 70-year-old shark who had retired from corporate law 5 years ago. He had been my mentor when I first started at Stratton Dynamics, a man who viewed the legal system not as a pursuit of justice, but as a complex board game where the rules were optional if you had the right strategy. We met in the back corner of a dusty used bookstore in the Wicker Park neighborhood, far away from the country clubs and steakhouses where Julian might have spies. Elias looked the same as always, a tweed jacket that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and eyes that were sharp enough to cut glass. I laid it all out for him, the Ponzi scheme, the forged signatures, the $28 million in debt, the mistress. Elias listened in silence, steepling his fingers. When I finished, he didn't gasp. He didn't offer sympathy. He laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "Textbook," Elias said. "The man is a classic narcissist with a gambling addiction disguised as a business strategy. He is drowning, Cora, and he has tied a cinder block to your ankle." "I want a divorce," I said. "I want to take him to court, expose the fraud, and clear my name." Elias shook his head vigorously. "No, that is the emotional play. That is the loser's play. If you file for divorce now and expose the fraud, the assets freeze, the forensic accountants come in, they will see your name on those loans. You say they are forged. Good luck proving that to a bankruptcy judge while the creditors are tearing the house apart. You will spend the next 10 years in litigation. You will lose every dime fighting to stay out of jail." "Then what do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You don't fight him for the assets. Cora, you let him win. In fact, you force him to win." He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and took out a pen. "The goal isn't a fair split," Elias explained. "The goal is total separation of liability. You need a divorce settlement where Julian voluntarily, explicitly, and aggressively claims 100% of the business and the real estate, and in exchange, he assumes 100% of the debt attached to them." "He won't agree to that," I argued. "He knows the debt is there." "He knows the debt exists," Elias corrected. "But he thinks he can outrun it. He thinks one big deal will fix everything. Narcissists always believe they are one lucky break away from salvation. You need to feed that delusion. You need to make him believe that keeping the company is the only way he survives, and that giving you a share would be a disaster for him." I understood. It was the toxic asset strategy. In risk management, when you have a radioactive asset, you don't try to clean it. You package it up and sell it to someone foolish enough to buy it. "Make him think he is robbing you," Elias said, a wicked glint in his eye. "Make him think the company is a gold mine, and you are too stupid to realize it. He will grab it with both hands, and he won't look at the fine print until the anchor is already around his neck." I left that bookstore with a plan. It was dangerous. It required me to stay in the house, to sleep next to the enemy, and to manipulate him into his own destruction. I started digging into Sienna. I needed to know if she was just a bed warmer or a co-conspirator. Using the access I still had to Julian's email, he never changed his passwords because he thought I was tech illiterate. I found the organizational charts for the shell companies. There it was. Sienna Miller, Chief Financial Officer. I almost laughed out loud. Sienna, whose previous work experience was as a hostess at a nightclub, was the CFO of a multi-million-dollar hedge fund. I pulled up the corporate filings. Her signature was on the quarterly reports. Her signature was on the tax declarations. Julian wasn't just sleeping with her. He was setting her up. When the house of cards collapsed, Julian could claim ignorance. He could say, "My CFO handled the books. I was just the visionary." He was positioning Sienna to take the fall for the fraud. It was cruel. It was ruthless. And it gave me exactly what I needed. I didn't need to destroy Sienna. Julian was already doing that. I just needed to make sure she stayed loyal to him until the very end. I began to collect evidence of their affair. I tracked Julian's phone location. I saved the receipts for the jewelry he bought her. I took screenshots of their flirty texts, but I didn't scream or cry. I filed them away in a folder named Leverage. I wasn't gathering this to use in court for a morality clause. I was gathering it to gauge their psychological state. I watched them get sloppy. They started going out to dinner in the city more openly. Julian stopped bothering to hide his phone screen. They were getting comfortable. They thought they had won. Meanwhile, I started building my freedom fund. I knew that when I walked away, I would have nothing but what I could carry. I couldn't transfer money from the bank accounts. Julian watched those like a hawk. So, I went manual. I took over the grocery shopping again. I would withdraw $500 in cash for household expenses and spend $200. The rest went into a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace on the library shelf. I sold designer purses that Julian had bought me years ago to consignment shops for cash. I pawned a diamond tennis bracelet, replacing it with a high-quality cubic zirconia replica that cost $100. Julian never noticed the difference. Over 3 months, I squirreled away $12,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a rental deposit and a few months of food. It was the price of my independence. But the most critical part of the plan was the psychological manipulation. I had to make Julian greedy. I had to make him terrified of losing the company. I started planting seeds. Small, calculated lies. One evening, while pouring him a glass of wine, I casually mentioned a conversation I had overheard at the salon. "It was so strange," I said innocently. "I was sitting next to the wife of that senator, the one on the infrastructure committee. She was talking loudly on her phone about a massive government grant for green tech investment firms in Chicago. She said they are announcing the winners next month." Julian's ears perked up like a dog hearing a whistle. Green tech. "Did she say which firms?" "No," I said, shrugging. "Something about firms with capital in the name I don't know. It sounded boring, but she said the grant was worth $50 million. I saw the gears turning in Julian's head. He didn't have a green tech division, but he could invent one overnight. The prospect of $50 million of free government money was like heroin to him. It was the lifeline he was desperate for. "Interesting," he muttered, pulling out his phone. 2 days later, I saw a new file on his computer, Green Energy Initiative. Project proposal. I did it again a week later. I left a fake note on his desk, written in a disguised hand, that looked like a message from a rival investor. "J. Heard rumors you are looking to sell Thorn Capital. If you are liquidating, call me. We smell blood in the water." Julian was furious when he found it. "Sell?" He stormed around the kitchen. "They think I am weak. They think I am selling. I will show them. I will never sell. This is my empire." The more I hinted that others wanted his company, or that the company was on the verge of a massive payday, the more possessive he became. He started viewing Thorn Capital not as a debt-ridden husk, but as a winning lottery ticket that everyone was trying to steal from him. And finally, the legal trap. I spent sleepless nights poring over the Illinois Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew how to read contracts. I found the precedent I needed. In a contested divorce, the judge divides assets equitably, but in an uncontested settlement, the parties can agree to anything, as long as it is not unconscionable. However, there was a specific clause about the waiver of appraisal. If both parties signed a waiver stating they fully understood the value of the assets and did not require independent valuation, the court would not intervene. I needed Julian to waive the appraisal. I needed him to say, on record, "I know what this company is worth, and I want it all." If he did that, he couldn't come back later and say, "I didn't know it was worthless." The waiver would lock him in. I sat in the dark of the library, the glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. The copy of War and Peace with my cash stash sat on the shelf. The hard drive with the evidence was safely hidden. I had turned myself into a mirror. I reflected Julian's greed back at him until he was blinded by it. He thought he was playing me. He thought he was the grandmaster moving the pawn. He had no idea that the pawn had already crossed the board and was waiting to become a queen. I looked at the calendar. The tax deadline was approaching. The lenders were getting impatient. I could tell by the increasing number of hang-up calls on the landline. The window of opportunity was closing. It was time to pull the trigger. It was time to give Julian exactly what he wanted. It began with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Julian stopped pretending to work late. He stopped making excuses about traffic or delayed flights. Instead, he simply stopped coming home for dinner. When he did appear, he smelled like a perfume counter and radiated the smug satisfaction of a man who believes he is rewriting the rules of morality. He began to take Sienna everywhere. At first, it was to industry mixers, where he claimed her presence was essential for her role as CFO. But soon, the society pages of the Chicago Tribune began to feature photos of Julian Thorne, CEO and guest at the opera, at charity galas, and at gallery openings. There they were, smiling for the cameras. Julian in his tuxedo, looking distinguished and wealthy, and Sienna clinging to his arm like a barnacle in a sequined dress. I was erased from the narrative. I was the wife at home, the footnote, the relic. The humiliation reached its zenith. At my mother-in-law's 70th birthday party, Beatrice Thorne decided to host the event at Oak Haven. Naturally, she loved my house, or rather, Julian's house, because it provided the perfect backdrop for her to hold court. She invited 50 of her closest friends, a collection of women who wore pearls the size of grapes and judged people based on their zip codes. I spent 3 days organizing the catering, arranging the floral centerpieces, white lilies, Beatrice's favorite, and ensuring the vintage champagne was chilled to exactly 45 degrees. I was the perfect hostess. I was the dutiful daughter-in-law. But when the guests arrived, Beatrice did not thank me. She did not even acknowledge me. Instead, she stood by the grand staircase, beaming as Julian walked in, and on his arm was Sienna. Sienna was wearing a red dress. It was a violent, screaming shade of crimson that clashed with the tasteful pastels of the room. It was tight, low-cut, and entirely inappropriate for a 70-year-old woman's birthday tea. "Everyone," Beatrice clapped her hands, silencing the room. "I want you all to meet someone special. This is Sienna Miller. She is the brilliant financial mind behind Julian's recent successes. She is a strategic partner to the Thorne family." A strategic partner. The room rippled with whispers. Everyone knew. They looked at Sienna, then they looked at me, standing by the kitchen door with a tray of smoked salmon canapes. Their eyes were filled with that polite, Midwestern pity that cuts deeper than an insult. They saw a wife being replaced in real time. Sienna beamed, soaking up the attention. She walked over to Beatrice and handed her a gift bag branded with a luxury jeweler's logo. "Happy birthday, Beatrice," she said, her voice loud and confident. "Julian and I picked this out together." I stood there, gripping the silver tray until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to walk over there and overturn the tray of salmon onto Sienna's overpriced dress. I wanted to scream that the strategic partner couldn't calculate a tip, let alone a hedge fund's risk exposure, but I didn't. I lowered my head. I walked into the crowd, offering appetizers to the very people who were gossiping about my demise. "Salmon," I asked softly. "Cucumber sandwich." "Oh, poor Cora," I heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her neighbor as I passed. "She really has let herself go, hasn't she? Look at those bags under her eyes." "Well, you can't compete with youth," the neighbor replied. "Julian needs someone dynamic. Cora was always so plain." I retreated to the kitchen to refill the champagne buckets. As I stood by the service entrance, I heard voices on the terrace. The French doors were slightly ajar. "She is like a ghost, Julian," Sienna's voice drifted in, sharp and complaining. "It is creepy. She just floats around offering food. When are you going to get rid of her? I am tired of living in that apartment. The closet space is a joke." "Be patient, babe," Julian replied. I could hear the clink of ice in his glass. "It is complicated. I have to manage the optics. If I kick her out too fast, she might lawyer up and try to grab the company. I need to make her want to leave." "Well, hurry up," Sienna snapped. I want to redecorate this place. That wallpaper in the dining room is hideous, and I want the master suite. I don't want to sleep in a bed she has slept in." "You will have it all," Julian promised, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Oakhaven, the company, the cars. She is weak. Sienna. She doesn't have the stomach for a fight. I will grind her down until she begs to walk away with nothing but her clothes." I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, the cold condensation of the champagne bottle dripping onto my hand. Grind her down. I almost smiled. Julian thought he was the pestle and I was the mortar. He had no idea that he was grinding gunpowder. The next phase of his plan was psychological warfare. He began a campaign of gaslighting so blatant it was almost insulting to my intelligence. It started with my appearance. "You look tired, Cora," he said over breakfast one morning, poking at his eggs. "Have you gained weight? Your face looks puffy." I hadn't gained an ounce. In fact, the stress had made me lose 5 pounds. "I am just tired, Julian," I said, looking down at my coffee. "Sienna runs 5 kilometers every morning," he said casually, turning the page of his newspaper. "She has so much energy. She is vibrant. You just seem to drag yourself around this house. It is depressing to watch." Then, he attacked my competence. "I saw the electric bill," he scolded me later that week. "It is up 12% from last month. Do you leave the lights on all day? I am out there working my fingers to the bone to keep this family afloat. And you are burning money like it is nothing. You are a financial black hole. Cora." The irony was rich. The man who had embezzled $28 million was lecturing me about a $300 electric bill. "I am sorry," I whispered, shrinking into my chair. "I will be more careful." "You are a burden," he sighed, standing up and adjusting his tie. "That is what you are, a dead weight. I need a partner who contributes, not a dependent who drains me dry." He wanted me to feel worthless. He wanted me to believe that I was lucky he hadn't thrown me out on the street yet. So, I gave him the performance he paid for. One evening, after he accidentally left a brochure for a retirement home on the kitchen counter implying that was where I belonged, I staged a breakdown. I waited until he was in the study, drinking his nightly scotch. I burst in, tears streaming down my face. I had rubbed my eyes to make them red and puffy. "Julian, please," I sobbed, falling to my knees by his leather chair. "Please don't be so cold to me. I am trying so hard to be what you want. Don't leave me. I can't survive without you. I don't know how to do anything. I am scared." It was the performance of a lifetime. I grabbed his hand, pressing it to my wet cheek. Julian looked down at me. For a second, I saw disgust. But then, it was replaced by a profound, sickening satisfaction. His chest puffed out. This was what he wanted. He wanted to be the god who held the power of life and death over his pathetic subject. He pulled his hand away and patted my head, like one would pet a dog that had just peed on the carpet. "Get a hold of yourself, Cora," he said, his voice smooth and superior. "You are embarrassing yourself, but I suppose I can't blame you. You know you are nothing without me." "I know," I wailed. "I know." "We need to talk about reality," he said, seizing the moment. "This marriage isn't working. I have outgrown you. Surely you see that." I nodded frantically, wiping my nose with a tissue. "I am willing to be generous," he said. "I will give you $20,000. You take Mia. You move to, I don't know, maybe back to your parents in Ohio. Start over. Find a simple job. Something suited to your capabilities." $20,000. It was an insult. It wouldn't even cover the retainer for a decent divorce lawyer. I looked up at him. I had to refuse, but I had to do it in a way that didn't make him suspicious. I couldn't show strength. I had to show fear. "Ohio," I whispered. "But Mia's school. My life is here. 20,000 Julian. How can I live on that? I can't. I am too scared." "Don't be greedy." His eyes hardened. "I have debts. Cora, the company is in a delicate phase. I can't just liquidate cash for you." "I can't sign yet," I said, shaking my head. "I need time. Please, Just give me a little more time to process this. I wasn't stalling for emotion. I was stalling for the calendar. I had checked the loan documents again. The big one, a $12 million short-term loan from a shadow banking group in the Cayman Islands, had a maturity date of March 1st. It was currently February 14th, Valentine's Day. If we divorced before March 1st, and the assets were transferred to him, the default notice would land on his desk, not mine. If we were still married when the loan defaulted, the creditors could come after the joint assets before the divorce was finalized. I needed him to take ownership before the bomb went off, but I needed the bomb to go off immediately after the ink was dry. Sienna, however, was not as patient as the creditors. I learned later, through the thin walls of the master bedroom where they now slept while I took the guest room, that she was furious about my refusal. "She is stalling. Julian," Sienna shrieked. "She is going to drag this out for years. She wants to stay in the house. You need to cut her off. Now." "She refused the $20,000, Julian said, sounding annoyed. "Then stop playing nice," Sienna hissed. "Divorce her. File the papers. Take everything. Tell her if she doesn't sign. You will sue for full custody of Mia. Tell her you will hire lawyers that will bury her in legal fees until she is homeless." "I want to protect the company," Julian said. "If she gets a lawyer, they will want to value the assets." "The company is fine," Sienna insisted, drunk on her own delusion. "We are about to get that government grant you talked about. We are going to be rich. Julian, don't let that leech take half of our future. Make her sign a waiver. Tell her the company is worthless right now anyway because of the market. So she is lucky you are keeping it." I lay in the dark in the guest room, listening to them plot my destruction. Sienna was doing my work for me. She was so desperate to be the lady of the manor that she was pushing Julian to bypass the very safeguards that would have saved him. The next morning, Julian slammed a folder onto the kitchen island while I was making Mia's lunch. "I am done playing games. Cora," he announced. His face was hard, his eyes cold. "This is the final offer. We are divorcing. Now." I looked at the folder. "I am keeping the company," he declared. "I am keeping Oakhaven. I am keeping the investments. You get the SUV and full custody of Mia. That is it. No $20,000. You get nothing." He leaned in, his breath smelling of coffee and aggression. "And you are going to sign a waiver of appraisal, because if you don't, if you try to fight me, I will destroy you. I will tell the court that you are unstable. I will tell them about your little breakdown last night. I will make sure you never see Mia again." It was a monstrous threat. To threaten a mother with her child was the lowest form of cruelty, but internally, my heart leaped. He had said the magic words: waiver of appraisal, keeping the company. He was demanding exactly what I needed him to take. I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was February 20th. The loan matured in 9 days. The timing was perfect. I looked at Julian. I let my lip tremble. I let my shoulders slump in defeat. "You would really take Mia from me," I whispered. "Try me," he sneered. "Okay," I said, my voice barely audible. "Okay, you win. I will sign. Just let me keep my daughter." "Good," Julian said, straightening his jacket. "My lawyer will have the papers ready next week. We go to court on the 28th. February 28th. 1 day before the loan default. It was cutting it close. It was a razor's edge, but it was the only way. "I will be there," I said. Julian smirked. He grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl, took a bite, and tossed it into the trash can, 1 bite taken. The rest wasted. It was a perfect metaphor for how he treated people. "Smart choice, Cora," he said. "At least you are not completely stupid." He walked out the door, whistling. He was going to meet Sienna to celebrate their victory. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the silence of the house. I looked at the apple in the trash. "Enjoy it while you can, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. "Because on March 1st, you are going to choke on it." The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was walk into that courtroom and play the final act of the tragedy. The office of Elias Thorne was the antithesis of the glass and steel cathedral where Julian held court. It was a small, converted brownstone on the near north side. Smelling of lemon polish and old binding glue, the shades were drawn, casting the room in a perpetual, dusty twilight. It was here, amidst stacks of case law from the 1990s, that we forged the weapon that would sever my chains. "It has to be boring, Cora," Elias said, peering over his spectacles as he handed me the draft. "It has to be the most tedious, soul-crushing document a human being has ever attempted to read. We want their eyes to glaze over by page 10. We want them skimming by page 30, by page 60. We want them contemplating suicide just to make the reading stop." I held the document in my hands. It was heavy. 80 pages of dense, single-spaced Times New Roman font. It was titled, "Settlement Agreement and Mutual Release of Claims." It looked like a standard, bureaucratic surrender. "Where is it?" I asked. "Page 65, Elias said, tapping the desk with a skeletal finger. "Clause 12B. I call it the Trojan horse." I turned to page 65. The text was a wall of impenetrable legalese, laden with Latin phrases and circular references to previous statutes. Wherein the transferee Julian Thorne hereby acknowledges, accepts, and assumes sole, exclusive, and irrevocable responsibility for any and all liabilities, encumbrances, liens, tax obligations, and debts, whether known or unknown, disclosed or undisclosed, contingent or actual, attached to or associated with the transferred assets, Thorne Capital and Oak Haven Estate, regardless of the date of origination, and hereby indemnifies, defends, and holds harmless the transferor Cora Ellington from any claims arising thereof. It was beautiful, to a layperson. It looked like standard boilerplate about taking over a mortgage. But to a forensic accountant, it was a nuclear option. The phrase, "whether known or unknown," was the key. It meant that even if Julian didn't know about a specific debt, or if he claimed he didn't know, I knew about the fraud he was accepting it. By signing this, he was legally stripping me of the joint liability status. He was voluntarily becoming the sole owner of the $28 million black hole. "Will it hold up?" I asked, my finger tracing the line. "If he signs it," Elias grinned, showing teeth stained by coffee. "It is ironclad. It is a voluntary assumption of debt in exchange for assets. The law assumes a sophisticated businessman like Julian Thorne reads what he signs. If he is too arrogant to read the fine print, the court will not save him." I took the document home. I felt like I was carrying a bomb in my purse. That evening, the atmosphere at Oak Haven was brittle. Julian was in the study, packing a bag for yet another business trip with Sienna. I walked in, my posture stooped, holding the thick folder against my chest like a shield. "Julian," I said softly. He didn't look up from his suitcase. "What is it now?" "Cora, I told you. The lawyers will handle the paperwork next week." "I don't want to wait for next week," I said, injecting a tremor into my voice. "I just want it over. I can't take the fighting anymore. I can't take the uncertainty. I had my family lawyer draw this up. It is exactly what you asked for." I placed the 80-page document on his desk. Julian stopped packing. He looked at the folder, then at me. Suspicion narrowed his eyes. "You had a lawyer draw this up. Who that dinosaur Elias?" "He is the only one I could afford." I lied. "He is retired. Julian, he just used a template. Look, it gives you everything. The company, the house, the cars. I just want out. I just want to take Mia and go." Julian walked over to the desk. He flipped through the pages, his thumb whirring past the dense text. He saw the sheer volume of it and grimaced. 80 pages, he scoffed. "Jesus, Cora, why is it so thick?" "Elias said it has to list every single asset to be legal," I said. "Every account, every property deed. He is thorough, but the terms are simple. You win, I lose." Julian looked at me. He was searching for the trap. He was a predator, and he knew that prey usually didn't jump into the mouth of the lion. But his narcissism was a blind spot. He wanted to believe that he had broken me. He wanted to believe that I was so terrified of his threats to take Mia that I was capitulating completely. "I will have Marcus look at it," he said, tossing the folder back onto the desk. My heart hammered against my ribs. Marcus Vance. Marcus was a shark. If Marcus sat down with a pot of coffee and a red pen, he would find Clause 12B on page 65. He would see the indemnification language and he would scream. He would tell Julian to burn the document. "Of course," I said, forcing a weak smile. "But please hurry. I just want to sign and leave." I left the room, my legs shaking. I needed to neutralize Marcus. I knew something about Marcus that Julian didn't. I kept tabs on the legal world. Marcus Vance was currently in the middle of a vicious, mudslinging divorce of his own. His wife had caught him with the nanny, and she was currently scorching the earth. Marcus was living out of a hotel. He was drinking heavily, and according to my sources, he had delegated almost all of his paperwork to his junior associates and interns so he could spend his days fighting his own custody battles. But a junior associate might still be diligent. I couldn't risk it. I needed Julian to pressure Marcus to skim it. I needed Julian to be in such a rush that he would order his lawyer to rubber stamp the deal. I needed greed. The next morning, I made a call to an old friend from college. David. David was now a high-end commercial real estate broker in Chicago. He owed me a favor from when I helped him audit his books 5 years ago and saved him from an IRS audit. "I need you to leak something," I told him. "I need a rumor to reach Sienna Miller's ears, and it needs to sound like inside information." The plan was simple. Sienna was obsessed with social climbing. She spent her days having lunch at the RL restaurant, a hub for gossip among the elite. 2 days later, the trap snapped shut. I was in the kitchen when Julian came storming in. His face flushed with excitement. He was on the phone with Sienna. "Are you sure?" he was saying. 5 times. "Are you certain?" He listened for a moment, then laughed a loud, barking sound of pure avarice. "My God, that changes everything. No, she doesn't know. She is clueless. She thinks the house is a money pit." He hung up and looked at me. I was washing dishes, scrubbing a plate with slow, methodical circles. "Cora," he said, his voice trying to sound casual but vibrating with energy. "I have been thinking, you are right. We should wrap this up quickly. For Mia's sake." I kept scrubbing. "Oh. Yes, I told Marcus to prioritize your agreement. We should sign it as soon as possible, maybe even this week." I knew exactly what had happened. David had done his job. Sienna had overheard a conversation at lunch about a massive zoning change coming to Oakhaven. The rumor was that a tech giant was looking to buy the entire neighborhood to build a corporate campus, and property values were projected to skyrocket. They believed the estate, currently valued at $5 million, would soon be worth $25 million. They thought they were about to steal a winning lottery ticket from me. If I found out about the rezoning, I would demand half. They had to get me to sign away my rights to the property before the news went public. Greed had bypassed their caution. That afternoon, I received an email from Marcus Vance's office. It was a cursory review of the agreement. "Mr. Thorne," the email read, "I have reviewed the settlement draft provided by Ms. Ellington's counsel. It is verbose and uses somewhat archaic language, but the material terms are incredibly favorable to you. She is surrendering all claims to the equity in Thorne Capital and the real estate. It is essentially a total capitulation. I see no reason to delay if you wish to secure these assets immediately. M. Vance." He hadn't read it, or if he had skimmed it. He saw, "She surrenders all equity," and stopped reading. He didn't look closely at the liability clauses buried in the middle of the document. He was too busy fighting his own wife to protect Julian from him. I smiled. It was the first time I had genuinely smiled in months. Julian came home early that day. He was manic. "Marcus says it looks good," he announced, grabbing a bottle of water. He made a few minor formatting changes, but the core is fine. We are going to court on the 28th. The 28th, I repeated. That is 2 days from now. Yes, Julian said, checking his watch. Don't back out now. Cora, you said you wanted this. I do, I said. I am just overwhelmed. It is for the best, he said, clapping me on the shoulder with mock sympathy. You will be happier in a small apartment, less responsibility. You were never cut out for this level of wealth. You are right, I said. I am not cut out for your world, Julian. I am going to burn your world down. I thought, the night before the court date, the tension in the house was palpable. Julian was pacing, checking his phone every 5 minutes, likely looking for updates on the fake real estate deal. Sienna kept calling him, her voice high and shrill through the receiver, telling him to make sure I didn't change my mind. I sat in the guest room, staring at the wall. My suitcase was packed. It contained only my clothes, Mia's favorite toys, and the hard drive with the evidence of the fraud. I checked the loan documents one last time on my secret laptop. Maturity date March 1st. If we sign tomorrow, February 28th. Julian would become the sole owner of the debt at 9:00 a.m. The loan would default 24 hours later. It was a mathematical masterpiece. My phone buzzed. It was Elias. Are you sure about this? Cora, his text read, once he signs, you are free of the debt, but you are also walking away with nothing, no alimony, no share of the assets. If the rumor about the zoning change was real, you would be losing millions. I typed back, the rumor is a lie. The assets are dust. The debt is real. I am not walking away with nothing. I am walking away with my life. I put the phone down. I could hear Julian in the master bedroom, laughing. He was probably drinking a toast to his own brilliance. He thought he had pulled off the heist of the century. He thought he had tricked his stupid wife into giving him everything. I lay down on the narrow guest bed. I didn't sleep. I visualized the courtroom. I visualized page 65. I visualized the ink drying on the paper. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. Tomorrow, Julian Thorne would walk into court as a king, and he would walk out as a peasant. And the beautiful part was, he would thank me for it. The countdown clock in my head was ticking so loudly, I could barely hear my own thoughts. 3 days, 72 hours, that was all that stood between me and the edge of the cliff. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from cold silence to a frantic, vibrating tension. Julian was no longer staying at Oakhaven. He had moved into Sienna's apartment in the city to prepare for the transition, but his presence was still suffocating. My phone buzzed incessantly with his messages. They were not the messages of a man confident in his victory. They were the messages of a man terrified that his prey might slip the trap. Do not be late on Tuesday. 9:00 a.m. sharp. I spoke to Marcus. If you try to renegotiate the alimony, I will pull the offer for the SUV. You will walk to the bus stop. Remember, Cora, you wanted this. Don't get cold feet. He was bullying me to the very end. He was terrified that I would wake up from my stupor and realize the immense value of the estate he thought he was stealing. He was guarding a pile of fool's gold with a shotgun, convinced I was trying to sneak in and take a nugget. On Sunday afternoon, 2 days before the hearing, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't save, but I recognized it instantly. It was Sienna. I stared at the screen for a moment, my hand hovering over the decline button, but then I remembered my role. I was the defeated wife. I was the woman who needed guidance. I answered. Hello? My voice was small, hesitant. Hi, Cora. Sienna's voice oozed through the speaker, sweet and sticky like cheap syrup. I just wanted to call and check on you. Julian told me you seemed a little shaky about the agreement. I am just worried about Mia, I lied. It is a big change. Oh, honey, I know, Sienna said, her tone dripping with a patronizing sympathy that made my stomach churn. But honestly, it is for the best. You know Julian. He is a shark. If you fight him, he will just drag this out until you are bankrupt. I am telling you this, woman. Take the deal. The 50,000 he is giving you. That is a lot of money for someone like you. You can get a nice little apartment in the suburbs. Maybe take a class. Start over. Someone like you. The phrase hung in the air. She thought she was speaking to a destitute housewife. Not a woman who used to model risk scenarios for billion-dollar mergers. You think so? I asked weaky. I know so, she asserted. Julian is generous, but his patience has limits. Don't push him. Cora, just sign the papers, take the check, and go. It is the smart thing to do. Thank you, Sienna, I whispered. You are very kind to call. I am just looking out for everyone's best interests, she chirped. See you in court? She hung up. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling not with fear, but with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. The smart thing to do. She had no idea that she had just advised me to light the fuse that would blow her own future to smithereens. But the universe decided to test my resolve one last time. That evening, Mia complained of a headache. By midnight, she was burning up. I pressed the thermometer to her forehead. 103 degrees. She was lethargic, her small face flushed and sweaty, whimpering in her sleep. Panic, real and primal, seized me. I was alone in this cavernous, echoing house. I administered fever reducers and sat by her bed, sponging her forehead with a cool cloth. But the fever refused to break. At 2 a.m, I called Julian. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy and irritated. In the background, I could hear the muffled sound of a television and Sienna's giggle. What? He snapped. Cora, it is 2 a.m. It's Mia, I said, my voice tight with worry. She has a fever of 103. I can't get it down. I think I need to take her to the emergency room. There was a pause. I expected him to ask which hospital. I expected him to say he was on his way. I expected, for just 1 second, that the father would override the narcissist. And you are calling me why? Julian asked. I froze. Because she is your daughter. Julian, she is sick. Cora, you are the mother, he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. That is your job. I have a very big day tomorrow preparing for the hearing. I need sleep. If you are too incompetent to handle a fever, call a doctor. Don't drag me into your drama. Julian, please, I said, shocked despite everything I knew about him. She is asking for you. Tell her I will buy her a toy when this is all over, he said dismissively. Handle it, and don't be late on Tuesday. The line went dead. I sat there in the dim light of Mia's bedroom, listening to the dial tone. I looked down at my daughter, who was tossing restlessly in her sheets. In that moment, any last shred of hesitation I might have harbored, any tiny, lingering doubt about whether I was being too harsh, or if destroying his life was truly justified, evaporated completely. He didn't care. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about the law, and he didn't care about his own child. He was a hollow shell of a man, filled only with greed and self-importance. I took Mia to the emergency room alone. It turned out to be a severe viral infection, manageable but scary. I held her hand while the nurses set up an IV for fluids. I sat in that plastic chair until dawn, watching the drip, drip, drip of the saline solution. By the time we got back to Oakhaven, it was Monday morning, the day before the hearing. I put Mia to bed. She was exhausted, but the fever had broken, and I went to my war room in the guest closet. I pulled out the hard drive. I opened the folder marked Tax Evasion. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing every document. I cross-referenced the dates. I checked the forged signatures again. There was a wire transfer of $2 million from the corporate account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Blue Horizon. Julian had marked it as consulting fees. I pulled up the IRS whistleblower submission form on my browser. I filled out every field. I attached the PDFs. I attached the emails where he discussed hiding the assets. My finger hovered over the submit button. If I sent this now, The FBI would be at his door by tomorrow morning. The hearing would be canceled. The assets would be frozen. But if I did that, the debt would still be marital. The joint liability would still apply. I would be innocent of the fraud. Yes, but I would be tied up in litigation for a decade, and the creditors would still come for half of everything I had. I closed the browser tab. Not yet. This was my insurance. This was the weapon I would use only if he refused to sign, if he walked away from the table tomorrow, if he showed even a moment of hesitation. I would burn him down right there in the courtroom. But if he signed, if he took the bait, then I would let the creditors destroy him first. The IRS could pick over the carcass later. Monday night, the house was empty. I had already moved my few boxes to a small storage unit. The furniture remained. It was part of the assets Julian was fighting so hard to keep, but the personal touches were gone. The photos were off the walls. The vases were empty. I sat in the middle of the living room floor. The moonlight streamed in through the massive bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. This house, I had wasted 5 years of my life trying to make it a home. I had polished these floors. I had hosted his parties. I had cried in these bathrooms. It was a beautiful, rotting mausoleum. My phone rang again. It was Elias. "Cora," his voice was gravelly and serious. "I need to ask you one last time. Are you sure?" "I am sure," I said. "Listen to me," Elias said. "I have seen this go wrong. Once he signs that paper, and the judge stamps it, the transfer of liability is immediate. You are free, but you are also severing your claim to any future value. If by some miracle Julian turns that company around, if that zoning rumor turned out to be true, you get nothing. You walk away with your SUV and your $50,000. That is it. You are trading a potential fortune for zero." "It is not a fortune, Elias," I said, looking around the dark room. "It is a cancer. He thinks he is winning a kingdom. I know he is winning a death sentence." "Okay," Elias sighed. "As long as you know, the waiver of appraisal is the nail in the coffin. He can't sue you later claiming you tricked him. He is legally declaring he knows better than you." "It is poetic, really." "It is necessary," I corrected him. "What time will you be there?" "I will meet you at the courthouse steps at 8:30, Elias said. "Get some sleep. Kid, you have a funeral to attend tomorrow." I hung up. I couldn't sleep. I paced the house. I walked into Julian's study one last time. His computer was in sleep mode. I nudged the mouse. The screen lit up. He had left his email open. I shouldn't have looked. I didn't need to look. But I couldn't resist. There was an email in the sent folder. Time-stamped 2 hours ago. The subject line was "A New Era for Thorn Capital." It was addressed to a list of potential investors' names I recognized as high-net-worth individuals, the kind of people Julian preyed upon. "Dear gentlemen, I am pleased to announce that as of tomorrow morning, Thorn Capital will be undergoing a massive restructuring. I will be consolidating 100% ownership of the firm, removing the passive shareholders and legacy family obligations that have slowed our agility. The dead weight is being cut loose. This divorce is not a setback. It is a strategic acquisition of total control. With the Oak Haven property positioned for massive appreciation due to upcoming commercial zoning changes confidential, our balance sheet has never looked stronger. I am inviting you to join me in this new chapter. The buy-in window opens Wednesday. Sincerely, Julian Thorne, CEO." I read it twice. Dead weight. That was me. Legacy family obligations. That was Mia. He was selling shares in a sinking ship based on a lie I had planted. He was so confident, so blinded by the prospect of total control, that he was already counting the money he would make from defrauding these new victims. He truly believed he was a genius. He believed he had outsmarted me. I closed the email. I shut down the computer. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. My old SUV was parked there, packed with the last of my things. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had refined itself into a pure, white-hot determination. I whispered into the darkness, "You want total control. Julian, You want to be the sole captain of the ship. I turned away from the window and walked toward the stairs. Fine, then you can go down with it alone. I went to my room, set my alarm for 6 o'clock, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. I was ready to buy my freedom, and the price tag was $28 million of Julian's debt. The air in courtroom 304 was stagnant, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. It sat heavy in my lungs, tasting of dust and the lingering, aggressive sweetness of Sienna's tuberose perfume. We were back where we started, but the lens had shifted. The blur of panic that had clouded my vision in the beginning had cleared completely, replaced by a hyper-focused clarity that made every detail stand out in sharp relief. I could see the lint on the shoulder of the bailiff's uniform. I could see the slight tremor in the court reporter's hands as she typed. I could see the bead of sweat beginning to form at the hairline of Marcus Vance, Judge Holloway, a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen every variation of human pettiness, looked down at the documents spread before him. He adjusted his spectacles, the wire frames catching the harsh fluorescent light. He picked up the settlement agreement, the 80-page tome that Elias and I had constructed, and weighed it in his hand as if judging the soul of the man who was about to sign it. He flipped to the back, then looked up, his gaze bypassing Marcus and landing squarely on Julian. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Holloway said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the mahogany table. "I have reviewed the terms of this dissolution. They are unusual." Julian sat up straighter, adjusting his silk tie. He mistook the judge's hesitation for admiration. "Unusual in their generosity. Your Honor," Julian said smoothly, "I am ensuring my ex-wife is taken care of." The judge did not smile. He turned a page, the paper rustling loudly in the silence. "You are retaining 100% of the business assets, specifically Thorne Capital, and all associated real estate holdings. In exchange, you are assuming sole liability for all debts and obligations attached to those assets." "That is correct," Julian said, checking his watch. "Mr. Thorne," the judge continued, removing his glasses and leaning forward, "this agreement includes a specific clause, the waiver of appraisal. By signing this, you are telling this court that you waive your right to have an independent financial auditor value these assets. You are stating that you are fully aware of the company's financial standing and that you accept the value, positive or negative, without contest." The judge paused, letting the gravity of the words hang in the air. "Do you understand that if the value of these assets is not what you believe it to be, or if there are liabilities you have overlooked, you will have no legal recourse to seek adjustment from Ms. Ellington later? You are flying blind. Sir, the court rarely advises this. It was the final safety net. The legal system was trying to save Julian from himself. All he had to do was say, 'Wait, maybe we should have an audit.' If he said that, the house of cards would fall. The fraud would be exposed by the auditors, and I would be dragged down with him." I held my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julian laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of incredulity. He looked at the judge with the amused tolerance of a genius explaining gravity to a child. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "I built Thorne Capital from a laptop on a kitchen table. I know every decimal point in our ledgers. I know the value of my empire better than any third-party accountant with a calculator and a checklist could ever hope to. I do not need an appraisal to tell me what I own. I am the valuation." He turned to look at me, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Besides, Ms. Ellington has no head for business. If we wait for an audit, she will just be confused by the numbers. I am doing this to simplify the process, to spare her the headache." I said nothing. I kept my face blank, a mask of passive acceptance. Inside, I was screaming. He just admitted it on the record. He just claimed total knowledge. Marcus Vance shifted in his seat. The leather chair creaked under him. Marcus was a predator, a man who made his living smelling weakness, and for the first time, he smelled something wrong. He looked at Julian. Then he looked at me. He expected to see a woman defeated. He expected to see a woman crying over the loss of her fortune. But I wasn't crying. I was sitting with my hands folded in my lap, perfectly still, watching Julian with an intensity that was almost predatory. Marcus frowned. He picked up the agreement and flipped frantically to the middle. His eyes darted across the text. "Julian," Marcus whispered, his voice low and urgent. Julian ignored him, reaching for his gold fountain pen. "Julian, wait," Marcus hissed, placing a hand on Julian's forearm. The contact made Julian recoil slightly. "What is it, Marcus?" Julian snapped, keeping his voice down but failing to hide his irritation. "We are at the finish line." "Look at page 65 again," Marcus murmured, sweat now visible on his upper lip. Clause 12b. The indemnification language is extremely broad, whether known or unknown. And look at her. "Julian," Marcus jerked his head slightly toward me. "She is too quiet," Marcus whispered. "She is not fighting for the alimony. She is not fighting for the house. She is handing you a $25 million estate and walking away with a used car. Nobody does that. Not unless the estate is toxic." Julian froze for a split second. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. He looked at me. I met his gaze. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I let him see the reflection of his own arrogance in my eyes. For a moment, the silence stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Then, a voice cut through the tension from the gallery behind us. "Oh, for God's sake, Julian!" It was Sienna. She was leaning over the wooden railing, her face contorted with impatience. She pointed a manicured finger at the clock on the wall. "We are going to lose the reservation at Le Monde," she hissed loudly enough for the stenographer to pause. "Stop letting your lawyer bill you for another hour of reading." She gave up. She lost. "Just sign the paper so we can go get a drink." Julian looked at Sienna. He saw the beautiful young woman in the red dress, the trophy he had won. He saw the life he wanted. Then he looked at Marcus, the sweaty, paranoid lawyer trying to ruin his victory lap. The greed won. It always wins with men like Julian. The doubt evaporated, replaced by annoyance. "You are paranoid, Marcus," Julian muttered, shaking off his lawyer's hand. "She is quiet because she is beaten. Look at her. She is terrified." He was right. I was terrified. But not of him. I was terrified that he wouldn't sign. Under the heavy oak table. My hand was clenched into a fist. Inside my palm, crumpled and warm from my body heat, was a small photograph of Mia. It was a picture taken at the park last summer. Her hair windblown, her smile missing a front tooth. I squeezed the photo. "For you." I thought, "I am buying your future." Julian uncapped the pen. The sound of the cap clicking off echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He smoothed the paper flat. He looked at me one last time. His lip curled into a sneer, a mix of pity and disdain. "You know, Cora," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with false benevolence. "I really do appreciate this. Thank you for not making this difficult. You were always a very reasonable woman. You know your limits." He was thanking me for knowing my place. He was thanking me for being the good wife who stepped aside so the great man could continue his ascent. I slowly unclenched my hand under the table. I took a slow breath. "You are welcome. Julian," I said softly. "I just want you to have what you deserve." He didn't hear the double meaning. He didn't hear the blade hidden in the velvet. He bent over the document. The tip of the gold nib touched the paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He signed his name with a flourish. Julian Thorne. The loops were large and aggressive. He dotted the I with a jab. He signed the first copy, then the second, then the third. With each signature, I felt a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. The invisible chains of the $28 million debt were snapping. One by one. The mortgage on Oakhaven snap. The loans from the Cayman Islands snap. The tax liens snap. He finished the last page. He sat back, exhaling loudly, and pushed the stack of papers toward the court clerk with the motion of a man discarding a used napkin. He looked like he had just conquered a nation. "Done," Julian declared. Marcus Vance looked at the signature, then closed his eyes briefly. He slumped in his chair, a man who knew he had just witnessed a catastrophe but couldn't quite articulate why. The clerk gathered the papers and handed them up to Judge Holloway. The judge took the documents. He looked at Julian, then at me. There was a strange expression in his eyes. Perhaps he suspected something. Perhaps he had seen too many divorces to believe that anyone walked away this easily. But the law was the law. The waivers were signed. The intent was declared. He picked up his heavy rubber stamp. Ka-chunk. The sound of the ink hitting the paper was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a prison door unlocking. Then, he picked up the gavel. "The court accepts the settlement agreement as binding," Judge Holloway announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "The assets and liabilities are hereby distributed according to the terms signed by both parties. The marriage of Julian Thorne and Cora Ellington is dissolved." Bang! The wood of the gavel struck the sounding block. The echo hung in the air, vibrating through the dust motes. It was over. Julian stood up immediately, buttoning his jacket. He turned to the gallery and gave Sienna a thumbs up. She let out a little squeal of delight and started gathering her purse. "Finally," Julian said, turning to Marcus. "Send the bill to the office. I am taking the rest of the day off." He didn't look at me. I was no longer his concern. I was a stranger. I sat there for a moment longer, my hands still resting on the photo of Mia. The silence in my head was profound. The ticking clock had stopped. The panic was gone. I stood up. My legs felt steady, strong. I smoothed the front of my skirt. I picked up my purse, a simple, practical bag, not the designer ones I used to carry. I looked at Julian's back as he walked toward the aisle. He was strutting. He was a peacock spreading his feathers, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already turned to quicksand. He thought the gavel signaled his victory. He didn't know it was actually the starting gun for his execution. I took a breath of the stale courtroom air. It suddenly tasted sweet. It tasted like oxygen. I turned to my left, where Elias was sitting in the back row. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. He knew. I stepped out from behind the defendant's table. I didn't walk toward the door. I walked toward Julian. The slow-motion clarity continued. I saw Sienna freeze as she saw me approaching. I saw Marcus look up, his eyes widening. I saw Julian turn around, his smile faltering slightly as he realized I wasn't slinking away into the shadows as expected. I walked until I was 2 feet in front of him. I stood tall. I looked him in the eye, really looked at him for the first time in years, without the filter of fear or love. And then, I prepared to deliver the punchline to the joke he didn't even know he had told. The echo of the gavel striking the wood block did not just signal the end of a marriage. To me, it sounded like the firing of a starting pistol. For months, I had been holding my breath, compressing my rage into a tight, dense sphere deep within my chest. I had walked with a stoop. I had lowered my eyes. I had made my voice tremble when I spoke. I had played the role of the victim so perfectly that even I had started to feel the edges of the character blurring into my reality. But the moment Judge Holloway said the words, "Marriage dissolved," the performance ended. The curtain fell on the scared little mouse, and the predator walked onto the stage. I did not rush for the exit. That was what they expected. They expected Cora, the defeated, the broken, the woman who had just been stripped of her home and her legacy, to run away and cry in her cheap car. Instead, I stood up. I moved slowly, deliberately. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my blazer. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling my spine straighten, vertebra by vertebra, until I was standing at my full height. It was a physical transformation. The slump vanished. The hesitation in my movements evaporated. I lifted my chin. I turned my head and locked my gaze onto the trio celebrating their victory a few feet away. Julian was laughing at something Sienna had whispered. He looked radiant, flush with the dopamine of winning. He looked like a king who had just executed the last rebel. I stepped out from behind the heavy oak table. My heels clicked rhythmically on the parquet floor. Click, click, click. It was a sharp, military sound. Julian heard it. He turned, his smile freezing halfway on his face when he saw me approaching. He expected tears. He expected a final plea for money. He did not expect the woman who was walking toward him now. I stopped 3 feet in front of him. I was close enough to smell the expensive cologne he wore, a scent that used to make me feel safe, but now just smelled like arrogance and decay. I looked at Sienna. I let my eyes travel over her smug face, her designer dress, her gloating expression. Then I looked back at Julian. The room went quiet. Even the court clerk stopped shuffling papers. The sudden shift in my energy was palpable. It sucked the oxygen right out of the air. "Julian," I said. My voice was not the whisper he had become accustomed to over the last few months. It was clear. It was resonant. It carried to the back of the room with the authority of a judge passing a sentence. "You won," I continued, holding his gaze. "You took it all. The company, the house, the cars, the glory." Julian blinked, confused by my tone. He recovered quickly, his smirk returning, though it looked a little uncertain at the edges. "I did, Cora, and you should be grateful I left you with your dignity. Now, if you will excuse us, we have a celebration lunch to attend." He made a move to step around me. I stepped sideways, blocking his path. "Not yet," I said. "I have a parting gift for you. It is customary, isn't it? A farewell present for the ex-husband who has everything." I nodded toward the back of the room. Elias Thorne stood up. He had been a silent observer in the back row, looking like a dusty piece of furniture. Now, he moved with a surprising speed. He walked up the aisle, carrying his battered leather briefcase. He stopped beside me, unlatched the brass buckles with a loud snap, and pulled out a thick, red envelope. It was not a valentine. It was the color of a stop sign. It was the color of emergency. Elias placed the envelope on the table directly in front of Julian. He didn't say a word. He just stepped back, crossed his arms, and watched. "What is this?" Julian asked, looking at the envelope with distaste. "Another begging letter, I told you. Cora, the financial terms are sealed. You are not getting another dime." "Open it," I commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Julian let out an exasperated sigh. He looked at Sienna, rolling his eyes as if to say, "Can you believe this woman?" He reached out and snatched the envelope. He ripped it open with a violent tear, eager to discard whatever was inside and leave. He pulled out the documents. The first page was white, stamped with the unmistakable seal of the Internal Revenue Service. The second page was a heavy, cream-colored notice from the central bank, stamped with bold red letters, notice of default and immediate seizure. I watched his face. It was like watching a demolition in slow motion. At first, there was confusion. His brow furrowed. He squinted at the text, trying to make sense of the words. Then, recognition set in. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. The color drained from his skin, starting at his cheeks and washing down his neck until he looked like a wax figure. His hands began to shake. The papers rustled loudly in his grip. "What?" he choked. "What is this? Why is this addressed to me?" "That," I said, pointing to the top document, "is a formal notification from the IRS regarding the audit of Thorne Capital for the tax years 2021 through 2024. It appears there are some significant discrepancies, specifically $8 million in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest due to the fraudulent categorization of personal expenses as business losses." Julian made a noise that sounded like a strangled cat. $8 million. "And the document underneath it," I continued, my voice smooth and clinical, "is a demand for immediate repayment from the shadow lenders you use to float your lifestyle, the Cayman Island loans, the bridge loans from Obsidian Holdings. They all matured yesterday. Julian, The total outstanding principal and interest is $17,400,000. Julian looked up at me. His eyes were wild. He looked like an animal caught in a trap, thrashing against the steel teeth. "No," he stammered. "No, this is insane. This is a mistake. And anyway, this is our debt. We are married. This is joint liability." He turned to the judge, waving the papers frantically. "Your Honor, she is trying to trick me. This is marital debt. She is responsible for half of this." I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not a nice smile. It was a smile that had been 10 years in the making. It was radiant. It was genuine. It was the smile of the executioner who knows the blade is sharp. "Actually, Julian," I said, leaning in closer. "It isn't." I reached over and picked up the settlement agreement that lay on the table, the agreement he had just signed. The agreement Judge Holloway had just stamped. The ink was barely dry. I flipped it open. I knew exactly where to go. "Page 65, I said clearly. I turned the pages. 30, 40, 50. "Clause 12B, I read aloud, my finger tracing the paragraph. "Let me refresh your memory, since you were too busy planning your lunch to read it. The transferee, that is you. Julian hereby accepts sole, exclusive, and irrevocable responsibility for any and all liabilities, debts, liens, and financial obligations associated with the transferred assets, whether known or unknown, disclosed or undisclosed." I looked up from the paper. "Whether known or unknown." I repeated. "You signed it. You agreed to take the company. You agreed to take the house. And in doing so, you agreed to take every single cent of debt attached to them." "I didn't know," Julian screamed. His voice cracked, high and hysterical. "I didn't know about the audit. I didn't know the loans were due today. You trapped me. You committed fraud." "Did I?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I seem to recall the judge asking you, specifically, if you wanted an independent appraisal. I seem to recall you standing right there, puffing out your chest, and saying, 'I am the valuation.' You waived your right to due diligence. Julian, you told the court you knew exactly what the company was worth. You lied to the court, or you were too arrogant to check. Either way, it is not my problem." Julian spun around to face Marcus Vance. "Marcus, do something, fix this. She can't do this." But Marcus Vance was not fixing anything. Marcus Vance was currently shoving his laptop into his briefcase with the frantic speed of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. He had heard the numbers, 8 million, 17 million. He knew exactly what Clause 12B meant. He knew that he had committed legal malpractice by letting his client sign that document. And his only priority now was to get the blast radius. "I have to go. Julian," Marcus stammered, not making eye contact. "I have a deposition. We will talk later." He bolted. He actually ran out of the courtroom. Julian watched him go, his mouth hanging open. He turned back to me, his face a mask of sheer terror. "Cora, you can't leave me with this. It will bankrupt me. It will destroy me. I will go to prison." "You probably will," I agreed cheerfully. "The IRS is not known for its sense of humor. And those lenders, the ones you borrowed 17 million from, I don't think they send polite letters when you default. I think they send people." I looked at Sienna. She had backed away until she was pressed against the wooden railing. Her face was as pale as a sheet. She looked at Julian, not with love, not with admiration, but with horror. She looked at him as if he were a contagious disease. "Sienna," I said, my voice cutting through her panic, "I wouldn't stand too close to him if I were you. The IRS tends to look very closely at the spouses and partners of tax cheats. And since you are the chief financial officer of Thorn Capital, well, I imagine your signature is on quite a few of those fraudulent tax returns. Isn't it?" Sienna let out a small squeak. Her eyes darted from Julian to the door. She realized in that second that the empire she had stolen was actually a grenade, and she was holding the pin. "I didn't know," Sienna whispered. her voice trembling. "He told me it was legal. He told me he handled everything." "I am sure he did," I said. "Good luck explaining that to the federal agents. They are usually very understanding about trophy girlfriends who sign financial documents without reading them." Sienna didn't wait. She didn't say goodbye. She turned and ran after Marcus, her high heels clattering frantically on the floor, leaving Julian standing alone in the center of the wreckage. Julian looked around the empty room. His support system was gone. His lawyer had fled. His mistress had fled. He was alone with the mountain of debt he had just fought so hard to claim. He looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The cruelty was gone. All that was left was a pathetic, small man who realized he had just sawed off the branch he was sitting on. "Cora," he whispered, "please, we are family. Mia, think of Mia." I laughed. It was a cold, short sound. "I am thinking of Mia," I said. "That is why I did this. I cleaned up her future. I made sure her mother wouldn't be dragged down by your crimes." I leaned in close. So close, I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "You wanted everything. Julian, you fought for it. You lied for it. You threatened me for it. You said you were the king of this castle." I reached out and patted his cheek, mimicking the way he had patted me when I pretended to be weak. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," I whispered. "Long live the king." I turned my back on him. Behind me, I heard a sound. It was a guttural, animalistic howl. "No, no!" I heard the sound of paper ripping. He was tearing up the notices, as if destroying the paper would destroy the debt, but it wouldn't. The ink was dry. The stamp was set. I walked toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. Elias was holding the door open for me, a rare, genuine smile cracking his stony face. "Well played, my kid," he murmured as I passed him. "Ruthlessly well played." "I had a good teacher," I said. I stepped out into the hallway. The air was cool and smelled of floor wax. But to me, it smelled like freedom. My heart was pounding. Not with fear, but with the adrenaline of survival. I had walked into that room with nothing but a plan and a prayer. I was walking out with my life back. I checked my watch. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The loan default notices would be hitting Julian's email right about now. The bank accounts would be frozen within the hour. By noon, the tow trucks would be at Oak Haven to collect the cars. By dinner, the locks would be changing. I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. I felt light, weightless. I walked down the long marble corridor toward the exit. I could still hear Julian shouting inside the courtroom, his voice muffled by the heavy doors, screaming at a judge who could no longer help him. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I dialed the number for the storage unit where my few boxes were waiting. "Hi," I said when the manager answered. "I will be there in an hour to pick up my things. And do you happen to know a good pizza place nearby my daughter and I are celebrating?" I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the street. The sun hit my face, the noise of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians. The wind off the lake washed over me. It was a beautiful day. It was the first day of the rest of my life, and I had 25 million reasons to smile. The sound of paper tearing is usually innocuous, a soft, dry whisper that signifies the end of a page or the opening of a letter. But in that courtroom, the sound of Julian ripping the IRS seizure notice in half was violent. It was the sound of a man trying to tear apart reality itself because he could not accept the nightmare he had just signed his name to. "No!" Julian screamed, his voice shredding the dignified silence of the Hall of Justice. "This is a lie. This is a setup. You planted this." He threw the confetti of torn paper into the air and lunged. For 10 years, I had flinched whenever Julian raised his voice. I had made myself small to avoid his orbit. I had walked on eggshells to keep the peace. But as he charged toward me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, watching him come at me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. He never reached me. Before he could take 3 steps, 2 bailiffs were on him. They moved with the heavy, practiced efficiency of men who had seen far worse outbursts than this. One grabbed Julian's right arm, twisting it behind his back, while the other slammed him chest first onto the polished mahogany table, the same table where he had just signed away his life. "Get off me!" Julian bellowed, struggling against their grip. "Do you know who I am? I am Julian Thorne. I own this city. Arrest her. She is the criminal. She defrauded me." The judge, Judge Holloway, was on his feet, his face thunderous. "Mr. Thorne, you are in contempt, bailiffs. Restrain him immediately." Julian's face was pressed against the wood, his expensive Armani suit bunching up around his shoulders, stripping him of every ounce of the curated dignity he held so dear. He twisted his neck to look at me, his eyes bulging, veins popping in his forehead. "You witch!" he spat, saliva flying from his mouth. "You tricked me. You knew. You knew the whole time you let me sign that death warrant." The room was frozen. The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. Mouth agape, the clerk was staring wide-eyed. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I walked forward until I was standing right next to the table where he was pinned. I looked down at him. From this angle, he looked so small. The giant who had cast a shadow over my life for a decade was just a man, a foolish, greedy, desperate man. "I did not trick you, Julian," I said, my voice calm and carrying effortlessly through the room. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. You demanded the company. You demanded the real estate. You demanded total control. You said you were the only one smart enough to run the empire." I leaned in closer, ensuring he heard every syllable. "You were so busy trying to steal a fortune from me that you didn't bother to check if the fortune was real. You wanted it all, Julian. Well, look around you. You have it all. The assets, the liabilities, the audits, the prison time. It belongs to you. You won." He stopped struggling for a second, the crushing weight of the truth finally piercing through his delusion. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw the light behind his eyes go out. He wasn't angry anymore. He was broken. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Sienna was trying to make herself invisible. She had seen the bailiffs, seen the violence, and her self-preservation instinct had kicked into overdrive. She was inching toward the double doors, clutching her bright orange Hermes Birkin bag to her chest like a shield, trying to slip out before the blast radius expanded to include her. "Sienna," I called out. She froze. Her hand was hovering over the brass handle of the exit door. She turned slowly, her face a mask of terrified innocence. "I have to go," she stammered, her voice high and thin. "This has nothing to do with me. I was just the girlfriend." "Actually," I said, pointing a finger at her, "you are the chief financial officer. I saw the organizational chart, and that bag." I nodded toward the $20,000 piece of leather she was clutching. "That is the Himalayan crocodile Birkin. Isn't it invoice number 4022, paid for by the Thorne Capital Corporate Expense Account on November 14th. I remember seeing the transaction." Sienna looked down at the bag as if it had suddenly turned into a radioactive isotope. "There are 2 federal auditors waiting in the hallway." "Sienna," I said, offering her a helpful smile. "They are seizing all corporate assets today, evidence of embezzlement. I would suggest you hand that bag to them on your way out. If you try to leave the building with it, they might consider it tampering with evidence, and federal prison is not really your aesthetic." Sienna let out a strangled sob. She looked at the bag, then at the door, then back at Julian, who was groaning on the table. She didn't say a word. She didn't try to defend him. She pushed the door open and ran, stumbling in her heels, likely straight into the arms of the IRS agents I knew were waiting in the lobby. Then there was Beatrice, my mother-in-law, the woman who had spent 10 years criticizing my table settings and telling me I wasn't good enough for her son. Was sitting in the front row. Her face was the color of old parchment. She was clutching her chest, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 17 million, she gasped, the numbers finally computing in her brain. The house Oakhaven, My sweet. Gone. Beatrice, I said, turning to her. The bank will change the locks by tonight. I hope you didn't leave anything valuable in the safe. Julian pledged the contents of the house as collateral 6 months ago. It was too much for her. Beatrice let out a low moan. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways onto the bench. It might have been a performance. Beatrice loved a dramatic exit, but honestly, I didn't care. The dynasty she thought she was protecting had just evaporated into mist. "Medic!" the bailiff shouted. Pandemonium erupted. People were rushing to Beatrice. The bailiffs were hauling Julian up to his feet to handcuff him. The judge was banging his gavel, demanding order. It was chaos. It was noise. It was the collapse of an empire. And I was the eye of the storm. I turned my back on Beatrice. I turned my back on the judge. I walked toward the center of the room where the bailiffs were holding Julian. They had pulled his arms behind his back and were clicking the handcuffs into place. Click, click, the sound of justice. I stopped in front of him one last time. He was panting, his hair disheveled, sweat dripping down his nose. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and confusion, as if he still couldn't understand how the mouse had built a mousetrap. I stepped close, invading his personal space, just as he had invaded mine for years. I leaned in until my lips were inches from his ear. "You told me I would walk away with nothing," I whispered, my voice intimate and cold. "You were wrong. I am walking away with my life. You, on the other hand, just signed a contract to take out the trash." I pulled back and looked him in the eye. "Thank you, Julian," I said. "Thank you for being so greedy that you saved me the trouble of destroying you myself." "Cora!" he screamed, lunging at me again, but the handcuffs held him back. "Come back here. You can't leave me with this. Help me." I didn't answer. I didn't blink. I turned around. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was steady. Clack, clack, clack. It was the rhythm of a heartbeat returning to normal. It was the sound of a clock starting a new countdown. I walked past the stunned lawyer's table. I walked past the gallery where Beatrice was being fanned by a court officer. I walked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. Elias was still holding the door open. He didn't say anything, but he winked. A slow, deliberate wink of a co-conspirator who appreciates a job well done. I stepped through the doors and into the hallway. The heavy thud of the doors closing behind me cut off the sound of Julian's screaming. 1 second, there was noise and fury. The next, there was silence. I stood there for a moment in the corridor. I took a deep breath. The air in the hallway was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and coffee. But to me, it smelled like the sweetest perfume in the world. It smelled like zero balance. It smelled like unmonitored credit cards. It smelled like autonomy. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. It was a cheap bag, bought at a discount store, containing only my wallet, my phone, and the hard drive. But it felt lighter than any Hermes Birkin ever could. I walked down the long corridor, past the marble columns, past the security checkpoint. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The Chicago winter wind hit my face, bracing and cold. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue. The sun was reflecting off the skyscrapers, turning the city into a canyon of light, the noise of the street, the taxis honking, the rumble of the L train in the distance, the chatter of people rushing to lunch washed over me like a baptism. I wasn't Mrs. Julian Thorne anymore. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the fraudster's wife. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. I dialed the number I knew by heart. "Mommy," Mia's voice came through the line, small and sleepy. She was still recovering, safe at the neighbor's house, where I had left her for the morning. "Hi, baby," I said, and I heard the smile in my own voice. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Are you done with the meeting?" she asked. "Is Daddy coming?" "The meeting is done, sweetie," I said, looking out at the endless horizon of the city. Daddy is going to be away for a long time. He has a lot of work to do. but I'm coming to get you." "Are we going home to the big house?" she asked. I looked back at the courthouse, knowing that legal papers were already being filed to seize Oakhaven. "No, baby," I said firmly. "We aren't going to that house. That was never really our home. We are going to find a new place, a smaller place, but it will be ours. A real home, with no secrets and no yelling." "Okay," Mia said, trusting me completely. "Can we get pizza?" I laughed. Tears pricked my eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. "Yes, we can get all the pizza we want. I am on my way." I hung up the phone. I looked down the long flight of concrete steps. Below me, the city was moving, alive and indifferent to the tragedy that had just played out in courtroom 304. Life went on, and for the first time in a decade, I was part of it. I didn't look back. I didn't look up at the window where Julian might be watching. I didn't care about him anymore. He was the past. He was a closed account. I took the first step down, then the next. My pace quickened. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I was almost running. I merged into the crowd of strangers, just another woman in a winter coat, invisible and anonymous, and I smiled. I smiled because I had $25 in my pocket and a rental application in my purse. I smiled because I was broke, single, and homeless, but I was free, and freedom, I realized as I disappeared into the flow of the city, was the only asset that truly mattered. Thank you so much for listening to this story of betrayal and justice. It was a wild ride, and I hope you enjoyed seeing Cora take back her power. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below and let's get a conversation started. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to BitterSweet Drama Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.